meeting is being recorded.
Hi, everybody. This is Byron Dacey. And our group has Chapter 13 talking about school finance and how public schools have money to pay for supplies and their teachers and things like that. So let's jump in here. U.S. Constitution imposes no legal obligation on the federal government to operate a public school system. State legislatures are generally authorized to provide for a public education system. So the right is placed on the states to compose a public education system. Like it says, there's no obligation set forth by the Constitution for them. A lot of this comes from the 10th Amendment, and that states that the powers not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So the constituents in each state or the states altogether. And one thing I found interesting in this is that it says that state support of the public education system is voluntary. You wouldn't think that would be the case, but it's very interesting that that's how they approach it. I mean, most states do generally come in and say, no, we're gonna back and support our public education systems to some extent, which we'll get into more with like taxes and other things like that. I just found that a very interesting fact. They may also levy taxes and develop a systematic method of distributing school funds, kind of I just talked about there. And then the school districts are agents of the state, but do not possess broad powers to levy taxes and are subject only to the powers delegated to them by the legislature. So the function of the state is to establish, it's on the states to establish, support, and maintain their public schools, as it's talked about here. One way that the federal government does support public education is through different educational initiatives, whether it's a categorical grant, a block grant, or there's various other initiatives that the federal government kind of puts in place for the ability for schools to get funding from them. Those have to be applied for and given that way. The legislature does have discretionary power to delegate taxing authority to local school districts if it chooses to do so. So as long as the state meets the state constitutional tax limitations are met. And then taxing authority cannot be delegated to subordinate bodies unless there are clear limitations or restrictions placed on the delegated powers. The General Welfare Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Congress is to provide power to tax and spend for activities not in the Constitution. So that's kind of where that comes from here. Another thing I found very interesting, talking about like taxing and supporting public educations, public schools, Hawaii is the only state that has one school district for the entire state. So they have that, and their funding for all their schools comes from one big pot. So it's not like here in Nebraska where we have a lot of different school districts. I mean, I just know in Omaha, we have at least 3 or 4 in the area where we'd all be having to pull from that same pot. They have just one giant district. So all their schools are getting their fair share of money. So taxation for public schools, state and local tax account for over 90% of the educational expenditures. Sales tax and income taxes are primary sources of state funding, whereas property tax represents the most abundant source at the local level. And we'll dive into a case later on in our slides that deal with property tax and the distribution of that, and how, depending on where you live, the amount of money that goes into your school. But we have someone else talking about that. Property taxes are generally characterized as real property or personal property and contribute the major source of funding for public schools. And the three basic types of taxes are progressive, regressive, and proportional. I know in Millard, my school district, anytime they're trying to raise a little bit of money for a different project or a major project that needed to be taken on for the district, they would bump property tax just a little bit, or they would take a little bit more and levy some of that money. Is like 1 cent per activity. It's very interesting how they pulled that off, and I wasn't really sure on how they were doing all that, but with progressive tax, the rate of tax increases on as the base increases. Consequently, a larger percentage of income is taken as taxpayer income increases. So basically, as the taxpayers make more money, the income brought in, or the tax income that is brought in, is increased as well. Personal income and property taxes are examples of a progressive tax. In regressive taxes, tax rates decrease when the tax base increases, with higher income residents paying a smaller percentage than the lower income residents. Gasoline, cigarette tax are examples of a regressive taxation. And then in proportional or flat tax, the rate remains the same, irrespective of the income or wealth. Sales tax and estate wealth are examples of proportional tax. Like I said earlier, Hawaii is the only state with a single statewide school district. Well, and then consequently, no property is levied for education and no prescribed formula is used to fund public schools. State support for public schools is derived from the general fund for those districts.
This is Jack Noakes. I'm going to talk a little bit about tax rate. When a local district formulates its budget based on anticipated needs of the district, it may be necessary to levy taxes to generate the needed funds. Tax rates are generally based on estimated revenue needed by the district to meet its financial needs. Estimated revenue projections must be realistic, made in good faith, and based on defensible grounds. And local school districts may not use their taxing authority with the express purpose of creating a surplus fund. It's not unusual for
Sorry about that.
It's not unusual for taxpayers to challenge the validity of a tax levy for school based on a claim that the tax levy is excessive and extends beyond the needs of the districts. And some of the notes I've written down, in a very early case, the Supreme Court of Illinois held that it's not constitutional, it's unconstitutional for a school district to levy taxes with the purpose of accumulating a fund to be used at some point in the future to construct a school building. So that's kind of like what this slide is saying. Schools can't build big funds off taxpayer money for bigger future purposes. It's also important to note that the schools are agents of the state. So the school taxes are viewed as state taxes and not local taxes. That being said, local school districts may be required to meet certain standards with establishing and maintaining their schools. The standards coming from state forces. Legal challenges to school funding. School finance programs have been challenged under both federal and state constitutions. Most of the challenges have focused on issues regarding equity of finance programs with respect to tax burdens. Other challenges involve assertions that parents and children are denied the benefits of an equal educational opportunity based on disparities in tax revenue and distribution of revenue among school districts within a state. So challenges by parents are most frequently based on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Um, because of that, most states have adopted minimum foundation programs that those help distribute funds based on a per pupil basis and based on the district's wealth and ability to pay. So basically, they just develop these programs that help with the disparities between wealthy and poor districts and the funding gaps between wealthy and poor districts.
This is Phil Jansen. I'm going to talk a little bit about a few of these cases that kind of go along with what Jack was discussing, the disparity between the wealthy and the poor districts. The San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez. Legal challenges were pursued at both the state and federal level, challenging funding programs throughout the country using the fiscal neutrality standard embraced in Serrano to address disparity in wealth among school districts. So it says embraced in Serrano. Serrano was a case that kind of fought against the quality of a child's education should not be based on the wealth of the district in which the child resides. So that was the Serrano case. But then on the next slide, we're going to get into a later case, the Rodriguez or San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez. In this case in Texas, it said reached the U.S. Supreme Court, and it ended up being a 5-4 decision. The Supreme Court reversed a lower court's ruling that the Texas finance system was unconstitutional. And later in the week in our discussion question, we'll get into this in even more detail, but just a quick timeline of this San Antonio versus Rodriguez case. In May 16th, 1968, there's 400 students who walked out of Edgewood High School in San Antonio. They were protesting inadequate resources and lacking certified administrators. So then a couple months later, in July of 1968, Demetrio Rodriguez and 7 other Edgewood parents filed for a class action lawsuit against the Edgewood ISD, or the school district, and condemned Texas school financial system unconstitutional. 3 years later, in 1971, there's a 3-judge federal district court that ruled in favor of Rodriguez and held that the Texas school finance system was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment, arguing education is a fundamental right, yet the state of Texas appealed it to the Supreme Court. So then 2 years later, that's when that 5-4 decision took place in the Supreme Court, and it ruled in favor of the defendants and declared no constitutional violation in Texas school financing system. So it rejected the argument that education was a fundamental right. So the court did note the discrepancies that were created by the funding system, where the great disparities existed regarding ad valorem taxes from one district to another. So ad valorem taxes just means according to the value. So, you know, for instance, some districts pay higher property taxes than others that Byron was talking about earlier in the slides. So the discrepancy, when I was researching this case a little bit, I kind of thought this was a pretty big discrepancy. It said mostly the Hispanic Edgewood district was receiving about $37 per student, and another more white district in the area, I think they called it, or the district was Alamo Heights, was receiving about $413 per student. So, you know, almost a $400 difference, where, you know, the Hispanic Edgewood district was barely getting any money per student, and the other one was getting, you know, $413 per student, or around that amount. So in spite of these discrepancies, you know, the court concluded that the Texas funding system did not work to the disadvantage of any class or group, since the disadvantages occurred only between districts, regardless of the relative wealth of any family within the district. So, you know, that goes into, you know, some areas are paying higher property taxes, and that's where the money's going to go. Says the Rodriguez ruling essentially removed future finance cases from reaching the highest court in the land, or the Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court decision effectively placed legal challenges regarding school funding programs in the state court, since education is a function of the state. So they wanted to leave those funding issues up to the states that we've discussed previously. The compelling aspect of the Rodriguez ruling was that Texas case did not interfere with a fundamental right, since education, while undeniably of high importance, is not recognized by the high court as being among those guaranteed by the Constitution. So, although it doesn't seem fair, the Texas educational system, it was still deemed to be constitutional because, they were still providing education, even though it wasn't necessarily, the same funding for all districts.
So moving on to equity funding and education. These next few slides are literally verbatim from the book. It's like the first full paragraph, like each line in there. So we don't have much to really expand on. So equity may be defined differently among state lawmakers. However, it typically means that per pupil expenditures are equally distributed through a local school district. Since property tax is most frequently used to support local education, there are disparities throughout a state based on the level of local revenue generated by property tax. And most states attempt to generate funding formulas that subsidize local effort to compensate for disparities among wealthy and less wealthy districts. So basically, they try to even the playing field in most states by creating formulas that will based on the size of your district or the amount of money that you're getting from property taxes into your district. They try to make a little formula that will probably shift more money into the poor areas than the more wealthy areas to help compensate. Jack, you wanna?
Yeah. Typically, the equity formula includes state aid minus local effort as a means of creating parity and funding schools throughout the state. Some states refer to such formulas as power equalization formulas or district equalization formulas. The theory behind this approach is grounded in the need to provide equal educational opportunities for all students, irrespective of socioeconomic status. Equal educational opportunity occurs when all school districts within a state have equal access to resources that are necessary to provide an education up to a prescribed level. Then equity formulas, by definition, are input-based and have been the target of legal challenges over several decades based on funding disparities. Then equity and adequacy of funding for public schools. In recent years, many states have commissioned studies to determine the adequacy of the public education system. The focus on adequacy is a departure from their traditional focus on equity. Equity denotes fairness, which suggests that all communities, rich or poor, are taxed at similar rates and have equal access to similar amounts of revenue per student, in which does not occur in most states. That's kind of what Phil was talking about before, and these slides are basically direct text from the book as well. And then Phil, you're gonna finish up?
Yep. So kind of the other end, instead of equity, they talk about adequacy. On the other hand, focuses on a minimal level of funding needed for every school to teach its students, thus subscribing to an education that is adequate rather than excellent. So, as bad as it sounds, they're kind of saying providing an education that's just good enough with that adequacy.
Yeah, there's no right to an excellent education, which is sad.
Yeah. And then to finish up, it says public schools across the United States are facing increased pressure to improve the overall quality of education provided for students and have commissioned adequacy studies. So that is something that I did a little bit to add from that book. You know, the data that's generated by these adequacy studies are often used to increase the state aid to the local school districts. So by taking part in these adequacy studies, they can increase their state aid or the state aid that they get from those local school districts. So I guess that's one important note that also comes from that text for that last slide.
Mhm.
Anything to add, guys?
Just talking back to the case that you went over, Phil, if I remember right, didn't they talk about how it was like a discrimination that like they based part of that decision on, like they thought it was discriminatory, and then the courts came back and said no, it wasn't put in place to be discriminatory. I think I read that about that case.
Yeah, I think they felt that it was discriminatory, but then it came out to be it was mostly because of, you know, the property taxes in that district, and that's why they were getting less funding than some of the other districts in the area. And we'll get more into that when we do our discussion question later in the week as well, because that's kind of, that case is basically what our discussion question is about.
Awesome. Well,